But in any event, I want to bring you greetings from our standpoint from the African American Genealogy Group of the Miami Valley. Before you is the current president and the president emeritus of the group, which will be 20 years old come June. Started in Yellow Springs, Ohio. One of the gentlemen, Art Thomas, is in Springfield. Bob Harris is in Yellow Springs. They are now in their 80s. That's an outstanding gentleman to know. And Hasker Nelson, who is here locally, was a part of that group at some point in time. I want to thank Brian and the staff here at the library, local history and genealogy department for giving us this opportunity and putting these programs on every year so that we are brought up to speed and knowledgeable about African American history. And we want to thank several people in advance. One who's present here this morning, this afternoon. I'm surprised to see him. He stepped in here, Mr. Preston Charles, who is the executive director of the Preston Charles Funeral Home, a longtime friend. Glad to see him. Mr. J.C. Battle, I think I got it right, the third, and Linwood Battle, junior owners and directors of the J.C. Battle Sons and Funeral Home. Mr. Julian Renfro and his wife Gail Hardner Renfro, owners and directors of the Renfro Funeral Home. Mr. Richard Stewart, we'll talk about him later, all of his 98 years old and his sound mind. Thankful for his input this past week. And then Bishop Clarence Glover of the House of Glover Funeral Home. They took time out to talk to us and share information, especially over the last couple of weeks. And we're thankful. And many people have responded to my Facebook inquiry when I asked if they remembered what African American funeral homes existed here in the city. I got a big blast from several people. We were asked to talk about some of the directors. I looked at the flyer, Brian, earlier. You said some of the directors. And in my exuberance, I tried to get every director I could think of. So we're going to try to get this done here in an hour. And Joyce will elaborate on this. One important note, we're not here to promote any funeral home over another funeral home. And we're not here to dissuade the use of any funeral home. We're just here giving the information that we've collected to give you a perspective. And most importantly, with it being Black History Month and the role that African American funeral directors played not only in this community, but around the country, especially during the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement. We want to acknowledge their presence and existence and also their contribution to our community. So I don't know if Joyce has anything else to add to that.
Well, is this one working right? No.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
One of the things that I always say to people is, you can't get out of this world alive. So you've got to have somebody to take care of your loved one. One thing that's very important to African Americans, and many people don't know this, but what we now celebrate as Memorial Day, it was called Decoration Day. And to the best of my knowledge, it started right after the Civil War, when Black people in the South had to bury their dead. And they always wanted to give what was known as a decent and proper burial. So that was very interesting long time ago. And when I said that to people, I said, well, I was born in the South, and I know that they'd always say, we got to give a name, a decent burial. And that tradition is carried on. Today, we have beautiful, elaborate, or very simple funerals. One of the things that we have today, and the reason behind that is we have these nice obituaries, and many of the funeral homes, they do a wonderful job. I always wonder, how can they do this? But they'll do it in color, they'll do your childhood pictures, they'll do everything to make it a memorable occasion, and it actually is a celebration. Those funeral programs came about because during the period of Reconstruction and post-Civil War, that's the only way Black people knew anything about the person who had died. It's very important that you write your history, your family history, so that when you die, and like I said, we all have to go, we can't get out of this world alive, good information can be put in that obituary, whether it's in the paper or the one that the funeral home prepares for you. At one time, the Cincinnati Post and the Enquirer did them for free. They put a nice announcement in there, and then they laminate it and give it to a family member. Now, if you want it, you've got to pay an arm and possibly a leg. So we're going to try to share some information with you. And as Thomas said, we're not pointing towards any one particular funeral home, Everything that we are giving out is for your information and for your knowledge, to broaden your knowledge. If you have questions, we'd ask that maybe you hold them to the end so that somebody else may have the same question. We don't have 2 or 3 of the same question. And most of all, we thank you for allowing us to share this hour or so with you and impart information that we have worked on for a long time with you, and hopefully it will be beneficial to you. Thank you for coming.
All right, I'm gonna start this off. I'm gonna be the starting pitcher, and then Joyce is gonna be the middle relief man as well as the closer to a degree. She's got more history in her finger than most of us have in our heads. So, but the first slide you have up on the screen is on the left. It's an article from the Cincinnati Enquirer in 1936, and of course we're reading this past week, and we mentioned a book by Susan E. Smith about African American history of African American funeral directors, and she mentioned a convention here in town of colored undertakers that they were known at the time, 1936. So you have up here an article about that meeting, and present was a gentleman named C.E. Jones. We're going to talk about him later. James H. Thompson, who at the time was the owner and operator of the Thompson Funeral Home. C.E. Jones was in Covington, and you see that James H. Thompson was named treasurer of the Cincinnati Union of the Association. And that name is really well known here in Cincinnati. St. Julian Renfro, who was the founder of the Renfro Funeral Home, he was named the president of the unit. So this took place in Cincinnati in 1936. So this is African American Funeral Directors, presented by yours truly, Thomas D. Jordan. D stands for delighted to be here. And Joyce Coleman. And today is February 16, 2019, here at Cincinnati, Ohio, at one of the best libraries in the country to do genealogical research is right here at this library, always consistently one of the top 10 libraries here in the United States of America. So our goals for today are to provide background on the history of African Americans in the undertaking profession, and to recognize and celebrate the plethora of African American owned and operated funeral homes in the tri-state area. With buyouts and mergers, as best as we can, sort out any confusion, and there is a little confusion, and ask, like Martin Luther King asked, where do we go from here? Suggested reading, this comes up and has come up often in our research. Cincinnati's Colored Citizens by Wendell Phillips Dabney was his full name, and that's a picture of him. Came out in 1926, and I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but I found this about 20 years ago. And in it, he does mention the undertakers here in the city. And it has been reprinted. And like I said, the book we just read, actually one of the best books I've ever read. I wish I could write like she did and have the time to do the amount of research. But Susan E. Smith, To Serve the Living, African American Funeral Directors, History of African American Funeral Directors in the African American Way of Death. And when I was talking to the Renfros, Gail Renfro remembered when she approached the funeral home to interview her husband's grandmother, Inez Renfro, but actually her husband's her father and mother, because by that time Inez would have been dead. So it would have been Julian's father and mother that she approached. So I asked Dr. Preston to kind of help me with some of these terms: undertaker, mortician, funeral director, and embalming. You'll see those interchange, especially if you're looking at census records and you're looking through newspapers. So correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. An undertaker is an archaic term. You really don't see it used too much anymore. The current term is mortician. It's a person whose business is preparing dead bodies for burial, for cremation, and making arrangements for funerals. Funeral director, person who owns and operates a funeral home, or one whose profession is the management of funerals, and is usually an embalmer. Now, there's a reason I went through these terms, and you'll see why I have a few minutes. Embalmer or embalming, the art and science of preserving human or animal remains by treating them in its modern form with chemicals to forestall decomposition. Now, here's the key: you do not have to be a licensed embalmer to be a funeral director. A lot of people are funeral directors, but they're not embalmers. And then there are a lot of people I've found out here in the industry who all they do is embalming. They do not necessarily own funeral homes, but their gift is embalming, and several funeral homes have used them. The African American funeral service has its roots in Egypt. Historians credit the ancient Egyptians with the creation of embalming techniques and elaborate funeral services for the dead. Slaves brought these West African traditions to the United States, and it was against the law for slaves to give their loved ones a decent funeral and proper burial. So even in one of the most significant times in our life, death, racism played a role. Raised its ugly head. The Civil War brought on an increase in the need for undertakers and the practice of embalming in the United States. Soldiers were dying on the battlefield. They were, especially if they died south, they would need to be transported back north, and there needed to be some means to preserve these bodies until they were returned to their loved ones in the north. And that's how the practice of embalming picked up during the Civil War. Funeral parlors were among the first businesses operated by blacks after slavery, and undertaking was a promising profession for any aspiring black entrepreneur. Yes.
Also, bodies used to be brought into the home. Now you go into the funeral home, view the body, you can have a service there. When my father died, when I was 3 years old, I remember like it happened yesterday when they brought this big thing into our living room. And there it was, and I couldn't understand why my daddy didn't get up. But, you know, that was the reason. But that's how a lot of funerals were at home, and a lot of repasts started that way because neighbors would bring food to comfort the surviving people and feed the people who had come in from out of town to express their sadness and sorrow. But the funeral home itself was an aftermath of the funeral presentation being done in the home of the deceased person.
So after the war and heading into the 20th century, as with all other facets of American life, segregation and racism even affected the burial of the dead and led to the creation of African American owned and directed funeral homes. And a couple of notes here. In 1924, the Independent National Funeral Directors Association was formed. In reading, they selected independent instead of, at the time, the term would have been Negro National Funeral Directors. Independent, they chose a word. And in 1940, a merger with the National Colored Undertakers Association and the Independent Funeral Directors Association took place. And that is on their website, the National Independent Funeral Directors Association. On this website, actually, the organization is known today as the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, and this information is on their website. Little history here, Prince Greer, first recorded an embalmer of color in the United States. He was working with his either a master or a Confederate soldier. Last name was Cornelius, and Cornelius noticed he had a gift for embalming, and that's how he became the first black embalmer in the United States, Prince Greer. And then the first black female undertaker in the nation, Henrietta Smith Bowers Duterte. I think she inherited after her husband passed away. William Porter, former slave who became the first black undertaker in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we'll ask you here in a second why that name sounds familiar. There's his obituary from the Cincinnati Enquirer, February 15th, 1920, listing him as an undertaker. Died Thursday, February 12th, 11:45 p.m. Union Baptist Church, if you're doing your history, you know this city. It's a historic church here in Cincinnati, and at that time located at the corner of Richmond and Mound Street. I always hear about Mound Street. Anybody know, when you say William Porter, anybody connected with him who's famous in this city? Who's? Jenny Porter. I wish I had some door prizes to give you. You got it right. His daughter was Dr. Jenny Davis Porter, the first African-American woman to earn a PhD from the University of Cincinnati and also the founder of Stowe School. Does anybody want to recognize this person? I got some cousins here. They ought to recognize him, but my wife recognizes him. Anybody recognize? Charles Valentine Sr. That's my wife's grandfather, and that's my wife's cousin right there. So that's your great-grandfather. And he's believed to be, this has been passed, this is one of those stories passed down. I have some questions about it, but we're gonna humor our family this morning. But he was believed to be the first licensed black embalmer in Cincinnati, Ohio. Wasn't a funeral director, but if you know anything about it, he was an itinerant embalmer.
And he did a lot of embalming for white funeral homes.
Gilligan's is one of them.
Yeah.
All right, having said that, we're going to get to African American owned and operated funeral homes in the tri-state. A few notes here. I'm ready to turn this over to Joyce after this. Most of the funeral directors were businessmen and women in their own right. Most had their beginnings in the historic West End section of the city. It's believed that 18 existed in the West End at one time alone. Many of the funeral homes followed the path of inner city migration and moved to the then suburbs, Avondale and Walnut Hills, but it's believed they weren't necessarily moving on their own course. They were pushed out of the West End. If anybody knows about the development in the West End and the infamous or famous, whoever you want to look at it, the master plan of 1947, which disrupted the West End and put what was called the Mill Creek Expressway, it's called I-75 now, that caused a lot of migration to the then suburbs. Many have second and third generation families involved in their operations. Many of the funeral homes were run by women after the passing of their husbands. And like many funeral directors around the country, they were at the forefront of the modern day civil rights movement. Last but not least, putting something in for my family, just throw it in there. Most of the funeral directors were U.S. military veterans. This is a grave site of my wife's grandfather, who you saw on the screen there, Charles Valentine Sr. He was from Maryland, served in World War I, and he was one of 4 brothers, actually, who participated in World War I out of Maryland. So I want to throw that in there, all right? So I turn this over to you now, the historian herself, my friend. She's known me since I was in the 4th grade at St. Agnes Elementary in Bond Hill, Joyce Coleman.
I'm not that old. I'm only 21, and I'll be 22 in April. Go back on that one. Just for a point of information, if a person served in the military, they can get a military headstone. You work with your funeral director, whoever's in the funeral business at the house, and they can give you that information. They can give you the paperwork to complete, and you'll have a free headstone. You don't have to go to one of the ones on Spring Grove or any other street and pay for a headstone, unless you want an elaborate one, something other than this. Most of them are very simple. You can get this, I think this is probably just the stone. They have the stone, the granite, and a bronze one. So you have a choice of 3. And the other thing that is of interest with this, with Mr. Valentine, he had, was it 3 or 4 brothers that all served in the military. Today, you can't do that. The military will not accept 4 men from the same mother into the military, because there was an incident that happened in World War II where they were all the brothers were killed, and there was nobody left to take care of the mother and the younger siblings who were home. So there was a law. I looked at it last night and thought I would remember it, but I don't remember the law. But that's a good point of information to remember. If you have a relative who was active military, they can get this headstone at no charge.
And this is at there's an old and new St. Joseph Cemetery on the west side of town of Bronx Hill, and that's where he is buried. Kind of like one of those Kunta Kinte moments.
Yeah.
We were Jackie and I went to the cemetery, and I got out of the car and I looked and I said, "Jackie, I found him." What you ready to say, Jackie?
No, you said he was a corporal.
Corporal,
Uh-huh.
All right.
I was trying to see the battalion, but I can't. This is Mary Andrews. Mary Andrews was a relative of Hamp Jameson, who had Jameson and Jameson Funeral Home at Mound and John, I believe it was. We have a lot of this information in your handout. Please take a set. They're on each chair and cherish them, because that's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into getting this and getting everything so that it was as near correct as possible. There were books looked at. There was information on ton of newspapers. There is a newspaper website that you can subscribe to if you're computer literate, and you can get a lot of information. But this is not a one-day project. Keep that in mind. I mean, it's a long time. That's all I can say. But Mary Andrews was a relative of Hamp Jameson. We're not exactly sure what the relationship was. I've heard say a cousin, different things, but we don't know. We know that she was alive, and she did have a funeral home, the last one that I know of. It's written there on our slide was at 3602 Reading Road, and that's at Reading Road in Glenwood. And at one time, the building was a purple building, so it stood out quite a bit. We had heard a number of stories about her, that she was a native of Georgia, but we also heard that she might have been a minister, but we don't know. We don't have anything to prove that. And please keep in mind that what we say here today is information that we have been able to find, either documented in newspapers, in census records, or in any historical record. Because if you do research, you have to have what's known as primary documents. And we do have some primary documents. But the one thing that we have, and it's very, very pertinent to African Americans, is our oral history. So a lot of this information has come down through oral history and oral tradition. So Mary Andrews Funeral Home, it's interesting that in 1940, Mary Norris Andrews owned and published the Cincinnati Independent, which was before the Cincinnati Herald. There was a weekly newspaper that was published and printed in the West End, and information about the residents of that area and other places in Cincinnati was there. One of the things I think I read, they had a little society column in there where we will say that Thomas Jordan came from Baltimore, Maryland, and visited his relative, and they would name a relative and give the street address. That kind of social information was in there. And the writing is very quaint to me. If they came by car, it says they motored down. Now, how many people today say somebody motored? They got in the car and went, or they got on an airplane. So we have to think about that and keep in mind the period of time that this information was written. The information is strange to us. It's rather quaint. It's different, but stop and think about it. It's a sign of the times, okay? And at the time, it was the only black newspaper printed in Cincinnati, and it offers jobs and job training for young blacks aspiring to be printers. And Cincinnati was like the lithographic capital of the United States. So it was very ripe for this newspaper to be here and people to be printers. We had a number of young men and women who became lithographers and who went into the print business. Okay? Our first one is George Coleman Mortuary, and these are not in any particular order. We don't have the oldest to the newest or the newest to the oldest.
There's a subliminal method to the madness.
Yes.
We'll see it develop.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Coleman's Mortuary was founded by Dr. George Harvey Coleman, who lived from 1932 to 1938. The mortuary was located on California Avenue, 1309 California Avenue. And this is very interesting, is that he was an accomplished organist, and he received a doctorate in music from the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, which is most unusual. Most funeral homes have a person who can play the piano or the organ, and now the keyboards and those things. But how many funeral homes have someone with a PhD providing the music for your loved one? And that, I think, is just very good.
When we do this one, Crittenden Funeral Home was one of those funeral homes that, as I was asking, I had never heard of it, but this is Breckenridge Crittenden. And that actually is a picture from the Pittsburgh Courier. They were talking about key businessmen around the country, and they talked about Breckenridge Crittenden. You can see that name again, Jones and Crittenden. The founders were Charles E. or C.E. Jones, who lived from 1880 to 1947, and Breckenridge Crittenden, 1883 to 1948. Both were Kentucky natives. Crittenden was from Midway, Kentucky. Jones was born in Covington, Kentucky. And the locations were 624 Mound Street, 602 West 7th Street, and 820 Lincoln Avenue. One of the things that I saw in the newspapers, anybody know who the Scottsboro Boys are? I see a hands, I see some hands there. Scottsboro Boys who were accused of rape on a train. And I can't remember exactly how many, if in my faint recollection, how many, if any of them were, actually there were at least 4 acquitted, because there are 4 meeting Breckenridge Crittenden at the Union Terminal in 1937, and he's shaking hands with their attorney. So Breckenridge Crittenden, and his funeral home lasted from 1923 to 1948. Again, look at that name, you're gonna see that name, C.E. Jones, some more as we go through here. And there's C.E. Jones, funeral home. She's not here. When I visited the Renfros the other day, she pulled out information, and one piece of information was from the magazine that circulated at one time called The Colored Embalmer. And it had C.E. Jones on it, and Julian Renfro, and this gentleman that was the director of the Morticians organization, R.R. Reed. And I was like, great God in heaven, here are all these people I've been reading about. The C.E. Jones is at the bottom of the page. Full name was Charles Edward Jones. He lived from 1881 to 1947. He purchased Wallace A. Gaines Funeral Home in 1913 and renamed it C.E. Jones Funeral Home, located at 29 East 7th Street and also a location at 635 Scott Street in Covington. So again, Brian, we have broadened this a little bit. We have gone across the river, but again, it's one of those funeral homes that came to our attention. After C.E. Jones' death in 1947, his wife, Anna Mae Watkins Jones, a former school teacher at the famous Lincoln Grant School, historic Lincoln Grant School, operated the funeral home business in 1961. A little piece of information we picked up on the back end of this. His sister Melvina married local he was called top colored realtor and owner of the famous Mann's Hotel, Horace Sudduth. So that's one of the things we were finding, all these little connections, and that's why I always tell people, be careful who you're talking about because they might be related.
The other thing, just a point of information, just within the last 6 weeks, the Mann's Hotel has been declared a historic site, and the city of Cincinnati is going to do some restoration. It had been Section 8 housing, and it was very run down. Horace Sudduth's daughter is living in Indianapolis.
Another interesting, I forget how much I put on here. After Anna Jones retired, James E. Simpson took over operation of the funeral home, and the name changed to Jones and Simpson Funeral Home. And after the city of Covington acquired the original site for parking, the funeral home was located to 1129 Garrett Street. It's not Gerard, you get
Garrett.
It's Garrett Street. And the clincher to all this later became known as Jones, Simpson, and Gee, and was eventually purchased by Thompson Hall, Georgia in 1999. And this gentleman here, James E. Simpson Jr., was the funeral director of Jones and Simpson Funeral Home. He was the first African American to win a city commission election in the history of Covington, Kentucky. And if you do a Wikipedia search, if you Google his name, all kind of hits will come up, and a Wikipedia article will come up, and it had to be about 20 citations or awards he had received. And I had never heard of him before in my life. It was one of the funeral homes he named. So you see the progression. C.E. Jones Funeral Home is Jones and Simpson Funeral Home. Quite an accomplished gentleman. E.B. Delaney and Sons Funeral Home, Covington, Kentucky. This is not the founder. This is actually the son, John W. Jack Delaney Jr. And the founder is John W. Delaney Sr., 1871-1927. You see that after his death, the funeral home was owned and operated by his widow, Elizabeth Berry Delaney, hence the name E.B. Delaney and Sons. And then son, John W. Jack Delaney, who died in 1991. Locations, 9th and Greenup, Covington, Kentucky, and 2142 Sinton Avenue.
And think about this, 1871. What happened just a few years before 1871? His Civil War ended. So he was right there, right in the thick of things, getting it started. Delaney Funeral Home, in doing this research and talking to some of my husband's relatives, I can't remember which one, but they were a part of that Delaney Funeral Home. They now live in Louisville.
One fact I found out looking, because every time I saw their names, I would go on the census record and try to find them. And I know that John Delaney Sr. never was noted as an undertaker. A lot of times you'll see it, you say, bingo, I've got the right one, but he was never noted as an undertaker or an embalmer or mortician. Consistently, even on his death certificate, his occupation was a seed inspector.
You know what a seed inspector is? That's something for you to look up. But it's very interesting when you see these things and you go, but in looking at it as a seed inspector, one of the largest areas in Covington where people could purchase seeds was within walking distance of his funeral home.
John Jack Delaney Jr. was a Kent County deputy judge. He was the first black to serve on the county's police merit board. Again, all these stories, breakthroughs. C.V. Douglas, which was not well known, I never heard of it till somebody mentioned it. Founders of Charles V. and Elizabeth Douglas. 6546 Montgomery Road in Kennedy Heights. It is now an art.
No, that's now the city, Silverton City Building.
Silverton City Building.
City Building.
Okay. What's that?
The location you're speaking of is part of
The Art Center? Okay, that was White Funeral Home. The name was
one
what?
time it was a white funeral, Stanley Hall.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
It was
Okay.
Stanley High, and I found out that was another 3-generation owned funeral home.
Mhm.
And there was even an article, we found in a newspaper where talked about the transition between Stanley High and to C.V. Douglas and his wife. Interesting fact I found out, C.V. Douglas's father, Vernie Douglas, was a Coleman porter for 30 years and then Amtrak for 15 years. He was instrumental in forming the local branch of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Anybody know who the Coleman porters are? I was with my
Chris,
niece.
you have to
I was with my
stop.
niece the other night, and we were showing her a video of Eyes on the Prize, and Fred Shulesworth popped on the screen and said, "You know who Fred Shulesworth is?" She went, "No." I said, "Oh," I did like Fred said, "We're ready to have a big one." Fred, you don't know who Fred Shulesworth is? Okay. This is Reverend Joseph Garr. This is a young picture I found online. He's not here to get me. This is 5 years into his pastorate, but I'll let Joyce talk about Reverend Joseph Garr funeral home.
Okay, Gar had a funeral home down in the West End on Finley. Remember we said earlier, most of these funeral homes had their origin in the West End. And the reason was that's where most of the black people lived. And they were close to. We talked about Renfro Funeral Home. Renfro was in one block, Battle was in the next block, and around the corner was Jameson and Jameson. But they were all right there together. Gar, he kind of moved away a little bit. You know, he was over on Finley Street, so he didn't really associate with those others. But they were all right together. He was also, he was a Korean War vet. He was wounded in his leg. He had what I call a gimp arm, and people have gimp legs where they don't have full capacity and use of it. Reverend Gar, he pastored Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church in Covington for 30 years. He had the funeral home on Finley, and he also had a church on Reading Road in Avondale, just before Fred Shuttlesworth Drive. Gar Funeral Home, some other interesting facts is that he served as the president for CORE. How many of you know what CORE is? Congress of Racial Equality. And he helped to lead the campaign to desegregate the theaters in Northern Kentucky. The Northern Kentucky theaters, even in the 60s, and I went to school, in the 60s, you had to go up to the balcony. You couldn't stay on the floor. Yes?
For those who don't know Fred Shuttlesworth, can you explain to us what he did?
Oh,
We'll do that a little later, okay?
Okay.
Okay, and Gar Funeral Home, 1997, a Nebulous Award recipient from Cincinnati Magazine. Dead Serious Politician Award for putting his campaign bumper sticker on his hearse. So, interesting fact. You would have no doubt about the fact that that was his.
He was running for city council in the 70s, and also he was running for council in Covington also. So
Right.
some little things we kind of found out.
Yeah.
Glen Hall Funeral Home. And Joyce will be elaborating. I see you clapping there. Glen Hall Funeral Home. I didn't see a picture of him, and the local funeral home establishment that we'll see then that acquired a lot of these funeral homes. I wonder if they have the pictures in their possession, but I didn't find a picture of Bynum Glenn. I had their names reversed at one time. I thought it was Glenn Bynum, and then it was Bynum Glenn. That's his obituary on the founders. We also, along with Walter D. Hall, founded the funeral home.
Okay, and for those of you who might have lived in Avondale, Glen Funeral Home was between Erkenbrecher and Northern, and Hall was there. There were 3 black funeral homes on Burnett Avenue between Erkenbrecher and Forest at one time. So they moved from the West End into Avondale, and they stayed close. Founders, Bynum Glenn, 1886. Again, keep in mind the date that these people were born and they went into this business and why they went into this business. And Walter Drew Hall, 1919, which wasn't that long ago, really. It's just 100 years ago that he was born. And it was located on Bird Street in Lincoln Heights, and then he was also in the 3400 block of Burnett Avenue, which was between Erkenbrecher and I think it's Norden. I get the two streets mixed up, Norden or Hearn. Okay, Walter D. Hall later became affiliated with Jordan Funeral Home, Glenn Hall Jordan. And that was the beginning of some acquisitions. And Donald Jordan was the owner of Jordan Funeral Home. He had his first funeral in his mother's living room in Middletown, Ohio. And he attended Miami University. And after he became funeral director and he saw the opportunity to move into Cincinnati, he moved from Middletown to Hamilton to Cincinnati. And from Cincinnati, Jordan owned at one time, as best I can count and find, he owned 14 funeral homes, either in, okay, I gotta hush. We got this.
Well, she's gonna give it away. But mention that Walter D. Hall again was. I'm starting to realize you start making assumptions. Everybody knows what you're talking about. So everybody doesn't know who Fred Shuttlesworth is. We will know that before we leave here, hopefully soon. Walter D. Hall was a Tuskegee Airman. That ring a bell with anybody? The famous Tuskegee Airman. All right, fighter pilots and fought in World War II. Red Tails. Anybody remember the movie Red Tails? All right. The library is here, and all this information is on the shelves in this library. You can find out about the Tuskegee Airmen. But he also worked for 14 years. I saw at the James Thompson Funeral Home. Again, there's a method to the progression of these slides. But Walter Hall, this is the lady you know that I didn't know until she told me about. Fred Green Funeral Home in Hamilton, Ohio. Bertha May Green.
Bertha May Green. Bertha Green. They had Green Funeral Home on Front Street. I think it's probably about the 700 block on Front Street. And they lived upstairs over the funeral home. And here's their little bio on her. She was one of the founders. She was born 1899. And Fred Green was born 1901. Ms. Green was a native of Atlanta, and Mr. Green was a native of Pell City, Alabama. So these Southern people came together. It was 918 Front Street.
Interesting fact, Fred Green's father, her husband, S.C. Green, first black mortician in Hamilton, Ohio, organizing an establishment known as S.C. Green and Sons Morticians in 1923. And you said they used to say that lady?
That lady. They always called her that lady with the funeral home. And she looked just like that picture.
House of Glover, Bishop Clarence E.H. Glover. I didn't know about all the initials till later on. Bishop Glover, I talked to him over a week ago. Fascinating gentleman. He was a founder, and at the time, 3602 Reading Road. You see these addresses keep popping up. Remember 3602 Reading Road before? Avondale, associated with Andrews Funeral Home. I saw a location of 5407 Ward Street, Madisonville. He's still technically operating. He is not operating that as a building, but he is operating. Because when I went in, he was working out of battle. When I walked in, I looked to the right, and there was a body. And people came in to meet him to have a private viewing. So he still is operating, he's still functioning. Interesting thing about him, and Preston knows about him, he's from a family of ministers, and his father, Dr. Sterling E. Glover, was a prominent minister in New Jersey and Cleveland, Ohio. He pastored for 40 years in Cleveland, Ohio. And as Preston, you told me that he was a director of the Port Authority, which is a big deal in Cleveland. And when I talked to him, I said, you know what? He was pastoring at the Emmanuel Baptist Church, and that struck it in my mind. I said, you know what? I have cousins that went to that church. And he asked me what the names were. I told him Washington and Woodard. He said, I remember them. And the only reason I know about them is through my genealogy research. So again, be careful who you're talking about. Everybody is related. And at one point in time, Bishop Clarence Glover was the chairman of the board of the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, and still serves as a committee assistant. All right, good. Move this along. Anybody remember Houston and Sons? Houston and Sons. This is Walter Scott Houston Sr., the founder, Owensboro, Kentucky native, later operated by his wife, Annie Mae Houston, and the son, famous attorney, Walter Scott Houston. Somebody will be waving some hands. Okay, there we are, right there. Everybody I remember. All right, locations 108 North Wayne Avenue in Laughlin and 2813 Gilbert Avenue in Walnut Hills. And there's some stories about
He
it.
also had one in Hamilton.
Was he one in Hamilton?
He had a funeral home in Hamilton on Front Street, right near the courthouse.
Like I said, more history in her finger than I got in our head. Walter Scott Houston died as a result of being hit by a train in Laughlin, and even made his hometown newspaper, Owensboro. He was in the car, but a train hit. And Annie Mae Houston Need Lee was a school teacher and is a sister of one of the directors coming up, Oscar S. Lee, who's the Oscar Lee and Sons Funeral Home founder. Anything you want to add on this gentleman? That's not the best picture I can find, but
Well, that was one from his obituary where they did a program at St. Paul's AME Church honoring him for his work. And one of the things that we look at, and many people don't realize, many African Americans belong to the Republican Party. And he was a staunch Republican. Now, this is the funny about Walter Houston. Walter Houston was a big man. He was a big man, okay? And he drove a silver Cadillac that leaned like this because he was so big, he had broken the shocks or whatever it was on that car, and everybody knew it. I know this for a fact. Walter Houston was so big that when he got sick and was in the hospital, they did not have a scale that went high enough to weigh him. And they took him down to the loading dock where they brought in, those 100-pound bags of potatoes and that, took him down there and weighed him on that scale. And I'm not going to tell you how much he weighed, but it was a bit much. I wish they had dollar bills that weighed that much.
and I think good, bad, or different. That's what Mr. Renfro, first thing he said when I talked to him today, he said he's a big man. I was like, wow. So, but a big, but a famous man. If you're going to be big, you might as well be famous, right? All right. This is her territory here. We start talking about the Jamesons. Interesting thing about the Jamesons, her and her, actually it turns out to be her second husband. I'll read that slide off. They stayed in the newspapers for something happening with their funeral homes, and that was interesting. But Cora Jameson, Trinity, South Carolina native, and she actually founded a funeral home with her husband, but they got divorced, and that's how there was a. See, I didn't even know that funeral home existed. I knew about Jameson and Jameson, but I didn't know about Cora. So you take it from here.
Okay, and Cora Jameson, we got here one of the locations, but they had a downtown location, and then they moved out, and I'm not really sure because I don't know the boundary line between Evanston and Walnut Hills. But that's where she moved her first funeral home, and then she later ended up on Reading Road, at Reading Road and Glenwood. And the interesting thing to me always was that the building was painted purple. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a funeral home in that kind of color. You just didn't see it. They were all subtle, and they still are today. But that was her funeral home. There's a little bit that we don't know about her. We know that she came to Cincinnati from Aiken, South Carolina.
This is a quote out of Mr. Harshaw's book as she's reading this about the West End.
Right. And she bought a church for her first husband, who was Robert E. Smith. And that church became Shiloh. I think it was a Baptist church, Shiloh Baptist. Robert stole thousands of dollars from Cora. They were always in the newspaper. And then he left town. So, okay. Reverend Mangrum became the pastor, and after his death, Cora changed the name to Greater Inspirational Tabernacle, where she preached occasionally. But we don't really have what would you call a church bulletin or program that has her name there as the preacher. Some of this, as we said earlier, it's information that has been given to us from oral history, which is the way we communicate and the way we pass stories down. But it's very important to write some of these things down. Okay, Henry Bobo Mathis, this came from, where's Harshaw's book? Is it up here?
It's not up here.
Okay, we got it.
But
It's here.
it came from Harshaw's book. He actually stated this in his book, Cincinnati's West End. So then you see she married Henry Jameson, and they operated the Cora Jameson Funeral Home together. And after their divorce, which is, again, was plastered in the papers, Henry started his own funeral home. There it is, right there.
Yeah.
Somebody had the Cincinnati's West End, Mr. Harshaw. That's what it looks like.
And he's got another book coming out. I'm working on it.
I may add one thing.
Yes.
Sure.
Pre-80s, Cora Jamison was known as the largest operator ever in the city at one time.
At one time, pre-80s, Cora Jamison was known as the largest operator of funerals. At one time, Cora Jamison,
Black.
black business owner. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We're glad you came.
That's why this preacher took advantage
Mhm.
Ah,
Hmm.
okay.
of it. A lot of
Okay.
stories.
Yes, I figured that out. That'd be a week-long discussion there. But then Jameson and Jameson Funeral Homes, Henry Hamp Jameson Jr., who was the nephew of her, turns out her second husband, Henry Jameson. One of my, and I was, as when I was talking to Mr. Stewart the other day, when I was in that funeral home, which is now Stewart Funeral Home, one of my vivid recollections, actually I had a friend that died. I was in the 6th grade, he was in the 5th grade. His name was Alsmer Broach. He died at 10 years old. That was my first acquaintance with the Jameson Funeral Home. That's where his visitation was held at. And when I went there the other day, I just kind of looked, you look around, looked strange. But Henry Hamp Jameson,
Okay. Founder was Hamp Jameson Sr., 1898 to 1950. He had the location, as I said earlier, at Hopkins and John in the West End, and then later moved to Montgomery Road, right across from the cemetery and the buildings on the corner. One of the things that someone told, I mentioned that we were going to be doing this, and they said, you know, he buried a lot of people, never got money, got paid for it. It was all on the books. So I said, yeah, that's real good. It's on the books, and he's dead. But what happened to it? The current owner is George Brown Jr., who's a great grandson of Hamp Jameson, Jameson and Jameson.
so that was the last information they had. Want to update us on that?
You never owned.
Oh,
Okay, so he's,
His two daughters, Colette and Judy, were the subsequent owners.
Okay.
George was a nephew of Colette and Judy. When the acquisition was, when Jordan acquired that business, then that was between Colette and Judy.
okay.
Colette and Judy went on, George stayed, and George became a funeral director along with the time.
Okay.
So I'll continue on being
okay,
That's all
thank
right.
you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
That's why you're here. Thank you. All right. But
very
he,
sharp young man.
is he? That was last, the way it appeared in it was a long write-up article that he was the owner, the way the papers actually portrayed it. That's the way they portrayed it. So you got the real, who's the gentleman used to say, and that's the real story?
The rest of the
That's the rest of the story.
Rest
I took a little liberty of Facebook. This is Libby Johnson Brown Swain. I saw Swain Funeral Home, and that building's the same building that Mr. George Coleman operated out of 1309 California Avenue. This will be interesting to you, be fun. Again, located on 1309 California Avenue. She does a lot of business, but now it's mostly out of the Dayton area. And while searching the newspapers, found this little interesting article. She might shoot me if she revealed it, but it's all public knowledge. Unusual undertaking in mortuary on the football field. She knows her burial rights. At one time, she was a cornerback for the Middletown Mavericks of the National Women's Tackle Football League, which I never knew existed. And there she is in her uniform. So all I got to say is I would not want to tangle with her if I had to.
One of the things that was interesting, when she took over that funeral home, all of her funeral personnel were women. And she had them all dressed in black with a white shirt or ascot, I can't remember, and a black hat. Everyone was a woman. They all, and everybody said, how are those women gonna carry those caskets? They did. Trust me, they did. They made a beautiful picture.
This is Oscar Lee and Sons Funeral Home. Didn't have a picture, but again, as we were doing this, we found obituaries left and right. We had obituaries of relatives, obituary directors. Oscar Lee, 65 when he died, and he was the founder again of the Oscar Lee and Sons Funeral Home. Again, obituary chock full of information. Graduated in 1927 from the Cincinnati College of Embalming. We actually passed Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science now, up by across the street from St. Xavier High School. We passed that on the way here. I said, how prophetic, as we're getting ready to go do this presentation. He belonged to Lincoln Heights Baptist Church, board member of the, I didn't know it existed, the Beech Grove Cemetery Association, which is in, Beech Grove Cemetery is in Wyoming, former member of the Laughlin Board of Health, life member of the Pride of the Valley, number 895, Masonic order. A lot of these funeral directors were Masons. So chock full of information there. And then you see his funerals at the Glen, at the time known as the Glen Hall Jordan Funeral Home Chapel, 400 North Wayne Avenue. Sound familiar?
I have his picture and his wife's picture.
You do have his wife? All right.
Wonderful. We know where to come.
When we update this, we get that from you.
Yeah.
All right. Native of Bath, Kentucky. Again, he operated out of 400 North Wayne Avenue, 618 Mulberry Street, also Laughlin. And interesting fact, again, his sister, Anna Mae Lee Houston, was the wife of Walter Houston, who was the founder of Houston and Sons. Again, they're all related. Y'all remember the saying now, be careful who you're talking about, because you might be related.
Or they may be, a relative may be listening to what you're saying.
We're starting to get a hit, we're starting to hit third base around home.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of information, but Jerry Clyde Maxey Funeral Home in Madisonville. And I found this little interesting fact. 1958, he was the first African American to win the JC Father of the Year Award. Just some little bits and pieces there. McKenzie Funeral Home, native of Arkansas. Again, Joyce talked about that neighborhood in Avondale, operated out of 59 Rickenbrecker Avondale, out of Avondale. I thought there was more information there, but there isn't. And then Pearson.
The funeral home was, everybody knows where the zoo is, right? At Erkenbrecker and Dury. And that's where McKenzie Funeral Home was on. If you would have come over Dury and your brakes failed, you'd end up at the funeral home.
Everybody remember? Yes, ma'am.
The building of McKenzie is still standing.
Still standing?
Yes, and so far as the Maxeys, Mother Roberta Maxey was one of the founders of the Martin Luther King Academy.
Speak up a little bit. Speak a little bit.
So everybody can hear
Was
you.
one of the founders of Martin Luther King Academy.
Okay.
And it started here in Cincinnati.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
All right. More information. Like I said, I think we're gonna be doing this 2 or 3 times for
I think so.
this presentation. So thank you. Pearson People, I recognize that name.
Yes, they were on John
Pearson People
Street.
were responsible for burying my great aunt. That's why my mother kept talking about Pearson People, Pearson People. And you see, these are the kind of ads that were circulating in the paper. Now, I saw Pearson People, I also saw Pearson People, but I saw was that located at John Street. This is their daughter, Elizabeth Pierce Coleman, but actually on this ad as Stiegel. So they gave me an indication, if you're a genealogist, that there was another marriage involved in there, but she eventually took over for a while from the Pearson People. Again, James Pierce and Gazella Pearson founders, both natives of Georgia, that's where my family's from, and their locations on John Street and Lynch Street in the West End. And there's their gravesite, Beech Grove Cemetery in Wyoming, very next street to Gazella Ward Pierce and James Pierce, the Pearson People. I remember the Rankin brothers. Remember that name?
Yeah.
I don't remember either, but I just know what people told me about, so I'm sure. Rankin brothers.
Okay, the Rankin brothers, native of Kentucky. How many of you know Bobby Rankin, who was in the Ohio State Legislature? This is his family's funeral home. And he was one of the people that worked there. He had a brother, we have Theodore there. And they succeeded him. I came across this one because of a death certificate that I couldn't read. For your information, your death certificate has all of this information: the day you were born, the day you died, where you died, your social security number, your mother's maiden name, your father's name, where you were born, what hospital, or if you were born at home. And then way down to the bottom, it has the information on your death certificate where a person is buried and who the embalmer was. And so when I came across this, I thought, Rankin Funeral Home. Then I started asking questions, and we started talking about it, and here we find the information. It was really true. So there are a lot of, I don't want to call them dead funeral homes, but they are. You know, they're no longer in existence. And we've got some here that, if you're as young as we are, you'll never know about them.
And interesting fact, later on, again, there's a progression to these. Robert Rankin became affiliated with the Thompson Funeral Home. The reason I know about the Thompson Funeral Home, it was the funeral home that my family used. The first funeral that I ever went to was my father's. Some 40, now it is 46, going on 46 years ago. And it was at the Thompson Funeral Home on Lincoln Avenue. That's why I always remember Thompson. You want to take me up? You want to hear me? I'll listen to your thing up there. He's going to pop me down. But just, again, another example of an ad that appeared in the newspaper, and you can see how Robert Rankin can affiliate with the Thompson Funeral Home. James A. Thompson, see Mr. Walter Hall's name, and Naomi Titus, 820 Lincoln Avenue. And last interesting fact, I meant to put a picture of her on there. Robert Rankin Jr.'s wife, Doris Rankin Sells. That name mean anything to anybody? Nobody's went. I'm a preacher. When I say that, this is call and response. When I say something, I want you to talk back to me. Does Doris Rankin Sells' name mean anything to anybody? There we go. That's what we're talking about. Was a local businesswoman who became the first African American female to own and operate a Wendy's restaurant chain. Doris Rankin Sells. So that connection. Remember who you're talking about. Just might be related. This was something that somebody put out on Facebook, and the only thing I could find was a couple of mentions on newspapers.com with the location. But if anybody can give us any more information, H.G. Sanders.
That's the one.
That's the one.
That's the one. If I remember correctly, H.G. Sanders was on 9th Street, right where the where the Phoenix Club and going over to where WLW used to be. And that was the funeral home of the rich and the poor. They buried some of Cincinnati's wealthiest people and some of their poorest people. They also had a contract with Hamilton County to either bury or cremate people who had bodies that were unclaimed. That was their name.
H.G. Sanders?
Yeah, it's not in existence anymore.
No,
It was bought out by another funeral home that is now in Hyde Park.
All right. Getting close. Donald and Stewart Funeral Home. Reverend Willie Ray Bubba Donald. And interesting gentleman on the right-hand side, 98-year-old Mr. Richard B. Stewart. Still going strong. The founder of Donald Stewart Funeral Home. Unfortunately, Mr. Donald died in 2008. Mr. Stewart is going to be 99 years old in December 20th, if I remember correctly, telling me. Mr. Donald's a native of Mobile, Alabama. Mr. Stewart proudly would tell you he's a native of Marion, Indiana. Locations at the time, 3939 Reading Road, which if you're coming up Reading and Paddock, or Reading and Paddock merged, there's a funeral home right there on the side, right there in the corner. That was where they were located. They also have a location now. He's working out at 3437 Montgomery Road in Evanston. Again, he's the oldest, as far as I know, and Chris, you can correct me. He's the oldest active mortician and embalmer in the city, still operating. Again, that was another place I went to, and he was waiting on the family to see. And the pictures are over there also.
Probably the oldest in the country.
Probably the oldest in the country. I would think that would be right. At 98 years old. My brothers asked me the other day, why are you still working at 98 years old? I said, you love what you do. That's not the bottom line on that. That's a picture of his 1943 license from the Indiana Institute of Mortuary Science, hanging proudly up on his wall. And that's the present location, Stewart Funeral Home, which used to be Jameson. Getting to the big ones, I told you we're getting close. J.C. Battle and Sons Funeral Home, they're the founders. J.C. Battle Sr., whose wife Teresa Battle, founded in 1932 by James Battle Sr., Teresa Battle, and at the beginning it was known as Coleman and Battle, located at 832 Bar Street in the West End. Then there was another location, 838 West 7th Street. I'll show you some pictures. We'll show you some pictures here. Joyce can talk over those. 502 East 13th Street in the West End, and then to the present location at 543 Rockdale Avenue, called the Family of Morticians. Third generation of family ownership following J.C. Battle and Teresa Battle Funeral Home from my sons Linwood Battle Sr. and Manuel Battle. I'm currently owned and operated by James C. Battle, the third Linwood Battle Jr., Miller Battle, Oliver. First funeral home to start offering video tributes. We see them often now, but they were the first funeral home to start doing that. And for more than 40 years, some member of the Battle family has been enrolled in the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science. And I tell you,
On this, for the first funeral home to start offering video tributes, they also offered like the connection. If you had relatives in California who could not come to the funeral, they had the hookup so that they could go to a particular funeral home and watch the funeral service here in Cincinnati and not have to incur the expense of coming to Cincinnati for various reasons. That was very, very, very good for a lot of people, because many people moved west, and if you think the quickest way to move is to fly. Otherwise, you've got to take 2 weeks off and drive back. But they offered that funeral to have the funeral on video, and the people could be in a particular funeral home and watch the funeral service.
and this fact, just to mention again, a lot of these families have families are served the country with distinction. They had another son I didn't know about before. Lieutenant James C. Battle Jr. was a merchant marine who drowned at sea, June 28, 1954. So I wanted to add that. There's a picture of the Kenyon Bar location. There's an article that the Battles gave to Joyce to look over. If you do Kenyon Bar, if you put Kenyon Bar in a search, especially on newspapers.com, and you filter the search to Cincinnati, thousands of hits come up about Kenyon Bar because it was a part of the section of Cincinnati that was involved in the new development in the West End. So that was a location, Kenyon Bar, 502 East 13th Street. There's a current location at 543 Rockdale. There's Linwood Battle Sr., Manuel C. Battle, who took over after their parents passed. And then the current owners, J.C. Battle III, Linwood Battle Jr. A lot of history. Renfro Funeral Home. Okay, anybody know about the Renfro Funeral Home? Wave at me. Say hallelujah, say amen. Throw your shoe up there. All right, Renfro Funeral Home. Founder St. Julian Renfro and Inez Renfro. Actually, that's a picture I obtained from Renfro the other day on Inez Renfro. There's locations at 752 West 9th Street in the West End. And an old picture of their current location of Avondale. There's a little better aerial shot. I like that. I just threw that in there for good measure because of all the hearse and the cars out the front. 647 Rockdale Avenue. Founder St. Julian Renfro and Inez Renfro. Julian was a native of Shreveport, Louisiana. Inez a native of Woodville, Mississippi. Again, location 752 West 9th Street, West End, at 647 Forest Avenue. Still in existence. Now I've heard 1921. I've also say 1922. So sometime within the next year or two, they will be celebrating 100 years in business. We're still functioning, operating. So I changed the slide. Want to add anything? Daughter Marietta Renfro Glenn and son Jennifer Willis Renfro, along with his wife Alaine, succeeded the parents and operated the funeral home. They're now owned and operated by Julian Renfro and his wife Gail Hardin Renfro. That is a shot of the side of the first ledger that they had from January 1st, 1922. That covered 3 years of their first years of operation. The first ledger that they had. And they still, like 1925 is again, almost 3 years, 1925, September 30th, 1925. There's Jennifer Willis Renfro, Marietta Renfro Glenn, the children of the founders. There's Alan Henson Renfro, wife of Jennifer Willis Renfro. They're the current owners. I could have stayed up, spent 2.5 hours with him the other day. I could have been there for 5. He's a funny man. As they say, he's a hoot. Current owners and directors. Inez Renfro was one of the most powerful black women in the city of Cincinnati and bolstered by the Republican Party. It's kind of hard when you hear that today, but again, if you know your history, the Republican Party was the party affiliation of many African Americans in this country before the early 70s, late 60s. Before the so-called Southern strategy took place. We hadn't talked about that in a time. She was also an accomplished pianist who taught music in Cincinnati. I told this to the Renfros the other day, they didn't know this piece. St. Julian was a subject of news around the country. He was evidently at one time an agnostic who was stricken dumb while waiting on the manifestation of the divine. And it made it out of the papers out of Cincinnati, and it was recirculated around papers around the country. And I showed it to Mrs. Renfro the other day. She said, "Ooh, I didn't know that." And she showed it to her husband. He said, "I never heard anything about that." She said, "Well, he was in Chicago," and he talked about his business. He said, "Yeah, he was in Chicago." And he said, "He went to Shreveport, Louisiana." He said, "Yeah, that's him." So that's the Renfros. Current director Gail Hardin Renfro was a reporter for the Cincinnati Post and director of the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce.
She also worked for Cincinnati Visitors and Convention Bureau.
And currently the longest running operated African American farm in our city.
Yes. Again, would be like what the next year to 100 years. Current longest running owned African American operated owned firm in Cincinnati, Ohio at this current time. Here's a progression. Thompson Funeral Home, James A. Thompson, I think his middle name is Anthony Thompson, if I have it correctly. There is a location that stands out in my mind, 820 Lincoln Avenue. It is now a 3-family dwelling, if I saw correctly on the auditor site. Three generations of undertakers again. James Harrison Thompson Sr. was a founder, native Lexington, Kentucky. One time, again in the West End. Everybody say West End.
West End.
Moved to Lincoln Avenue. Years of existence, technically 1899, 1997, and it merged with Hall Jordan Funeral Home. So in there's a case where it still exists, but as the Thompson Funeral Home, it lasted to 1997. 3 generations again of family operated funeral home with sons James A. Thompson Jr. taking over, and then followed by son James A. Thompson, oldest African American owned and operated business in Cincinnati prior to its merger with Hall Jordan Funeral Home in 1997. And then here we go. Here's where it gets kind of complex. My friend, Brother Preston, if he wants to chime in, he can if he wants to.
Yeah.
Reverend Donald H. Jordan, Sr., founder of the Jordan Funeral Home, which eventually became the Thompson Hall Jordan Funeral Home. I hope you see the progression, how Hall got added on and how Thompson got added on. They were part of, this is through his acquisition and mergers with other funeral homes. That's the current location on Winton Road. Donald Jordan Sr. passed 2 years ago, 2017. First location was at 918 South Main Street in Hamilton. There were also locations in Evanston, Silverton, and Forest Park. Now you said 14, but I saw 10. So between 10 and 14 locations in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana he had at one time. Been in existence since 1953. Reverend Donald Jordan pastored Anderson Chapel AME Church in Madisonville. Then he pastored Quinn Chapel AME Church in Forest Park. And in Bonner Hill now, Allen Temple AME Church until his passing. He was known as the acquisition merger king of local funeral directors. Somebody shout hallelujah. Hallelujah. Now when I'm preaching, everybody get tired, I say, y'all say amen. We'll get through this real quick. Say amen. All right. Case in point, December 13th, 1997, Hall Jordan buys then the Thompson Funeral Home, which is the oldest black-owned business in the city at the time. And then in 2004, Thompson Hall acquired Jameson for $1.1 million. These are all the acquisition mergers that I saw on his obituary. They obtained Lee Funeral Home in 1966. I figured out about 1969, the Glenn Hall Funeral Home, Houston and Sons in 1972, Pearson People in 1974, Rassman in 76, Denman Riddell, the Green Funeral Home in 1990, Thompson Funeral Home in 1997, 1999, Jones and Simpson over in Covington. Everybody go, whew.
Yeah, you're tired.
Lavinia's Home for Funerals in Indianapolis, Indiana, Summers Funeral Home in Indianapolis, Indiana, and then Jameson and Jameson Brown in 2002.
And we don't know the name of the one in Columbus or the one in Dayton.
Or the one in Dayton. Those are the ones we know of. These are,
He didn't own them.
You did not own them?
No.
so the newspaper again had it wrong.
He's speaking about Gary Memorial in Columbus, and Dayton, I'm not sure which he's speaking of.
She has some information somebody gave her saying.
Yeah, saying that he was. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
But again, the paper has it as in owning his funeral. Some will say, these next two are, we'll say the sons of Donald Jordan Jr. There's his Middletown location, Donald Jordan Memorial Chapel. That location is in Hamilton, Middletown, and Dayton, in existence since 2017. Interesting information on him. He left the funeral home industry and entered law enforcement for 10 years, serving the communities of Woodlawn, Ohio, and Forest Park as a police officer for almost 7 years. So he could arrest you and bury you.
At the same time.
Y'all missed that. He is an FFA licensed pilot and state certified peace officer. There's, I use that picture, I thought this was that. There's a gentleman here sitting here in the second row. My friend who's helped in a wealth of information, Preston Charles Funeral Home. And I'm being biased glad for him. And my wife already knows if something happened to me, he'll be the first one she's gonna call. Just remember that. I hope it ain't anytime soon, somebody been praying. All right, see, amen to that. Preston Bernard Charles, I'll put you on blast until it do. It's not your middle name. Where did somebody get? Somebody hit Bernard. What is it?
Bell.
It's Bell. Somebody said Bernard.
That's all.
That's why you're here. So we're gonna correct that to Bell. Cleveland native. 400 North Wayne Avenue and now 918 South Main Street. Is that correct?
Correct.
Started in 2017. Been in the funeral industry for 36 years. Is that correct?
37.
30, going to 36, 37 now. This is off an old article anyway. As a funeral director in Balmer and is known as a master restorative artist. And he told me this other day, the first person he saw, if I had this correctly, do an example of embalming, was the Bishop Clarence Glover, House of Glover, when he was up in Cleveland, Ohio. How about that? So be careful who you're talking about.
Yeah.
You might be related. Then last but not least, McCall Funeral Home. Reading Road. Sorry, Brian, I gotta get them all. I'm sorry, I blew it up. Founder Edward McCall Jr., 800 Reading Road, which was also the former site of Cincinnati Baptist Theological Cemetery. Has been around since 2012. Seminary, that's it.
Cemeteries.
That's the T. That's got a little subtle hint too. All right. Mr. McCall's mentor is Mr. Richard Stewart. Mr. Stewart told us the other day. He said I mentored him. Mr. McCall's father, Mr. Edward McCall Sr., played professional football for the Bengals and the 49ers and professional basketball for the Cincinnati Royals. How about that? All right. In closing, question is what?
Where do we go from here?
Out of the Dayton Daily News several years ago, some say black-owned funeral homes are endangered. Out of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, African American funeral homes face their own set of challenges. And here's all, ironically, these are the people we got to talk to the last 2 weeks. Mr. Battle, Linwood Battle on the left, Mr. Charles, Gail Harden Renfro, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Glover. Historic independent African American funeral home director say service is key to survival. A lot of things going on in the industry, and we can entertain questions. I'm glad Charles, the president, is here to help us. But that is where we're at, and hopefully you found out something new.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
What's the average cost for a funeral nowadays?
There's a funeral director.
On a national scale, it's approximately $6,200. Here in Cincinnati, it's about $4,200. Yeah.
Now with the crime rate, like how y'all do that? Like so, like crime rate, y'all rise the prices. I mean, prices on.
I'm sorry, dear.
Like do y'all do like crime research and stuff like that to figure out what prices y'all gonna use?
No, it's actually, to give the business term, is what the market can bear.
Oh.
So that's the reality of funeral business.
Oh.
And is there anyone who has a contract now with the indigent and the poor? Who buries them when there's no money?
Hamilton County has it, and my understanding is that it rotates. It may be at Mr. Charles's funeral home for a year, it may be at Renfro for a year, it may be at the Battle. They rotate. And how it's done, I don't know.
There's really no funeral home per se that you can call and say, I need you.
There's no funeral home you can actually call and request an indigenous burial. The government started cutting back on allocated funds for indigenous burials in the early 90s. So therefore, there's no funding. So what happens when remains become unclaimed, the county keeps those remains at the coroner's office. And once they become unclaimed for a period of time, then that crematory, which is now Spring Grove, at that contract, will take final disposition of those remains.
So like the gentleman, case in point, that died in Fountain Square. He
If no one came to submit funding for his service, which I believe did, there was a community outcry on his behalf, and he was, I believe, given a proper burial, from what I understand.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The other thing is that if a person dies, say a person drops dead on the street, and if they have any identification, if you read the paper, the coroner's office puts a little thing in there that says, anybody knowing anything about Joe Blow, please contact, and they give you the name of a person in the coroner's office. And that runs, I know it runs for 2 weeks, because I followed one for 2 weeks. So you can go, if you happen to be a relative and you've been wondering where this person was, they're probably in the coroner's office, and you can go there and claim them.
I used to hear people talk about the potter's field, different people being married. Now, what exactly, I once heard it referenced as being Baltimore Pipe. So does anyone know actually what the potter field, where it was?
It's become
In all actuality, there's no true Potter's Field anymore. There used to be such a place, but because of the advent of cremation, there's no longer
Excuse me, there's no longer truly a Potter's Field in Greater Cincinnati.
So where was that location?
What happens now is if the remains, they're going to be cremated. If no one claims them, the county will set aside that payment specific to that authorized agent, being the crematory.
But where was that location and
The
was
last,
that marker?
my last recollection of Potter's Field was Old Hillcrest Cemetery in east side, Beachmont area, on the east end. There was at one time indigenous burials at Wesleyan Cemetery, $100 burial. There was at one time a $750 indigenous burial at Walnut Hills Cemetery, indigenous burial. There was a $750 allocation at Vine Street Hill Cemetery for indigenous burial. Indigenous, and also at United Colored American Cemetery on Duck Creek. That's where the people who could not afford the standard burial could be buried in a plain grave only. There are no longer any more plain grave burials that I'm aware of in Greater Cincinnati.
Are there markings? I mean, or is there some kind of marker?
Could you speak up so we
No.
all can hear you?
She asked the question, are there markers for those areas? Absolutely, unfortunately not. They will put a number on those spots, from what I understand, only. The family could not even put a headstone on those graves. The cemetery would keep proper records of such location for that person. And now, because cremation is becoming the so-called new normal, that is the next step of the process of today.
Do you know someone who you think was buried at a Potter's Field?
Yes, ma'am. We were told, and it's an ugly story, but I have a relative in one, and we've been researching and trying to find, actually, he was a Coleman porter. And it is said that she, you know, for whatever reason, and we didn't understand that because he had family, you know, to claim the body and so it was kind of a done out of spite kind of thing. And we've been looking for years, trying to get some kind of.
When did he die, may I ask?
I would want to say it was in sometime like in the 80s, early 80s, like around 81.
Have you got the death certificate?
No, ma'am, I don't have it, but I can retrieve it.
That would be your first step, is to get a death certificate and see where, if the body was cremated, it's stated on the death certificate. If there was a burial, it's stated on there, and usually where they're buried. Many times, if the undertaker knows, because the undertaker has to sign off on that, they will tell you at Spring Grove Cemetery, Section A, lot so-and-so, plot so-and-so. That would be your first step. But there is a Potter's Field over where the old Dunham Hospital used to be, but they have not buried anybody there for a long time. And no, there are no markers there. I did a project with some students from Northern Kentucky University, and we went there and cut back with those, what did I tell you those things are called? You know, those nails, you just cut them back. And we started, there was a student from Duke University who was doing a project and wanted to see that. So my students and I from Northern Kentucky University went over, we went 3 or 4 times, cut back the bushes and dug down to the ground to see a little thing, probably about the size of this, with a number on it, as he stated. And then you have to go. But I don't think anybody's been buried there since maybe the 60s. But those little things are there. My suggestion to you would be first get a death certificate for that person.
Yes, ma'am.
You may find that that person was cremated, and who knows, the person that gave the information may have the ashes. Or they may have had the ashes buried. So, but you would find that information first. First place is death certificate. And the other thing, if there was a burial, and Mr. Charles can back me up on it, they keep excellent records at the funeral homes. They want to know almost how many times you had your fingernails cut in the last week or so. They ask questions that are really important for you when you're doing a genealogical study and search for a relative. So if they died in Hamilton County, you can go to Elm Street.
Right.
Or if you live in or close to Norwood, I think that the Norwood Health Department is giving birth certificates or they sell you the birth certificate or the death certificate of anybody from Hamilton County. If they died in another county, you'll have to contact that county.
He
Your vital
died in this county, and I used to work for Vital Statistics when they were in City Hall, so I have, familiarity, and I will do that. Yes,
Go to
ma'am.
Elm Street. There, right
Yes,
now, I
I
think
will.
everything is at Elm Street.
Right.
And if you find out that this person is buried and that they were buried in the Potter's Field over by the old Dunham Hospital, you can go to the University of Cincinnati Library, the Bladen Library, and find a little more information on it.
Okay, thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
I think she had a question.
Wait, there's somebody before you, in back of you, had their hand up.
My family, some years ago, we did the pre-planning, pre-planning, and that has turned out to be good because it saves a lot of frustration. It saves, we're already grieving, so that has turned out to be very well. My question is, we also have paid for mausoleum space for burial, but now, and that's been paid off. My question is, can we now switch to cremation and get a refund? I mean, cremation,
Who did you
I
make
know
your
that sounds a
pre-plans
little,
with?
tricky, but, we paid quite a bit of money for that mausoleum. And, we haven't gone to the company yet to discuss it, but I just wanted to get some feedback, so when we do go, we would know what to expect.
Before you answer, doing this and talking to Bishop Glover, no, and Brian's giving me that Undertaker look, when they give me that look like, you gotta get this.
Get the show on the road.
Talking to him the other day made me realize that we might do this again with updated and correct information. But also there's a piece when I was talking to him that made me realize a lot of people, period, and I will streamline it to a lot of people in the African American community do not know everything that's involved and needs to be taken care of when their loved one dies. And something he said made me realize that it would be important to do this again, and also an instructional piece. Maybe some good records that can help us out. So I'm gonna let you answer that question, and then Brian might be wrapping this up.
Please give me the mic.
In closing, pre-planning, ma'am, is very key to planning in general, estate planning. You're concerned about the mausoleum purchase. What, unfortunately, what the cemetery is going to do, they're not going to buy it back. That's one thing. Number two, if they're going to tell you to go sell it. They're going to tell you that you would have to put it on Facebook, put it, notify funeral homes. They would, if a family comes in to inquire about an entombment or mausoleum burial, placement, I should say, then that funeral home could potentially sell that space for you. How many years ago did you do it?
Oh, it's been maybe about 10 years.
10 years ago? I'm just throwing a number out, and if it's Spring Grove, that could be anywhere from $7,000 to $12,000 for 2 spaces.
Yeah, it was
So-
costly.
And so with that being said, they will not sell, if someone wanted to walk in and buy your space, they will not sell it. You would have to bring the seller, the buyer, and do the paperwork to transfer it. You would have to actually be present or know someone that would like to buy it from you. So you could put it in the Herald, you can put it on Facebook, but nonetheless, both parties would have to come and do the paperwork for the proper transfer. That's how they'll tell you. If I'm wrong, let me know. Last thing about pre-planning. Say you pre-plan a funeral with a funeral home that's gone out of business. Don't you think that's a great question?
Yes.
Okay, well, the real question is, where's your money?
Mhm.
And if your money is not there, the state of Ohio would have to substantiate that through the Attorney General's office. But what normally happens is those funds are transferred. In this day and age, you cannot pay a funeral home cash money for a pre-planned funeral. You have to give it to a third-party entity, which will govern your money for that firm or for you at the time of your demise. Therefore, that means wherever your pre-funds are submitted, they're transferable to any firm, anytime, anywhere. If you move to Chicago, your monies go to Chicago. Just because you pre-planned it here, it's in a fund that is growing infinitely until you pass on. And forgive me for my appearance, I'm going to a gala this evening. I didn't come here for this. That's all right.
We thought you dressed up as
So I don't dress like this every day.
Have a good time.
Yeah, the Martin Luther King Feed the Hunger program tonight, and where is it? Off of near IKEA, one of those convention centers. But I would love to come back because the conversation of a lifetime is essential for all of us. We're not here forever. Proper planning, proper consideration, many options. As I've stated, cremation is the new normal. It is not the only way that's going on. In our community, meaning the African American community, traditional funerals are still around 70% of our business. And the Caucasian community is 50% plus cremation. So that is one reason why acquisitions are happening in the funeral business. That's why Spring Grove has acquired the largest African American funeral home this city has ever built. Okay? So with that being said, options are always available. Okay?
Who did Spring Grove acquire?
Hall Jordan. As you saw the litany of acquisitions, Mr. Jordan was a very daring, challenging, charismatic man. He just, business, competition, things just didn't continue on. However, his influence continues through his son and through myself and others, because we have to maintain what we are part of, business people. I'm Black owned, I'm Black operating, and Black finance. That was the most difficult part for me, to find financing. But I thank God today that my partners and I are in the market. And forgive me for blowing my own horn, but nonetheless, I was blessed to work with the Georges for those 35 plus years. He gave me a chance when no other funeral home in the city would, since I was from Cleveland. So I was on Lincoln Ware a couple weeks ago. I don't know who's seen that. He asked me, he said, I'm the new guy on the block. No, not the new guy on the block. I've been here since 1976 when I graduated from high school, University of Cincinnati, in the mortuary school. So my wife and my 5 children and my 7 grandchildren are all here. So in y'all beautiful city of Cincinnati.
Thank you.
Now, what part of the body do y'all burn when y'all cremate?
Whole body, whole body. We don't have a crematory, but cremation is, as I said, is a reasonable alternative to the traditional funeral. So your whole body goes into a chamber for cremation.
Brian's gonna wrap this up, but again, questions like that and the ones we keep getting, and if you direct any funeral, okay, so wait a minute. Those again made me realize that there's an important component to really educating our communities about the funeral industry, especially now with all the acquisitions and everything. And if we communicate that to you in the future, we get a little warmer, make sure we're out of snow and ice and freezing temperatures. No, thank Brian. He's the one that asked us to do it. I learned a lot. Like I said, there's some updated, correct information we need to make, but I learned a lot. I think I grew more in this project. I kept driving my wife crazy. Every time I'd find something, I keep telling her it'd be in the middle of the night. That's when my eyes are ready to look at this PowerPoint. And just again, in the history of this country and the role that African American funeral directors played in some of the most pivotal civil rights moments in history. As we get ready to close, when Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were murdered in 1964, in the summer of '64, when they were doing the voting rights campaign, Mickey Schwerner's wife wanted her husband to be buried alongside of James Cheney, and they refused to bury him. Segregation was that thick and rigid. And some funeral directors one couple funeral directors I know. My mother's from Meridian, Mississippi, where James Cheney is from. I visited his gravesite. This book here, if I had to recommend a book, I would get that book and read it 2 or 3 times. It was phenomenal, fascinating reason reading, and I will say this and shut my mouth, let Brian come and bail us out.
Got one more question.
Considering
You got one question.
what African Americans have been through in this country, I keep saying it over and over, and no disrespect to anybody, it is amazing that we didn't become the terrorists in this country. It's a testimony to our perseverance, loving and forgiving in spirit, and and even the genealogy pieces made me appreciate my ancestors and all their proclivities and all the crazy uncles and weird aunts. It made me realize they had fought so much of their Adamic nature in addition to segregation and racism and we were riding on their shoulders. And that's why we appreciate you doing programs like this and allowing this opportunity to share. Yeah, one more question. Is this a funeral director question?
No, this is really, you should do this again.
Yes, ma'am.
But what I wanted to say though,
Hold the
too,
mic
in
up, sir.
reference to the lady talking about the pre-planning and everything, a lot of people pre-plan, but they never really check the papers and things that they have through the years that they have. And you actually should check, because so many of the places sell out to other things, just like what Preston just said. And you don't know whether you got something or you don't have it.
Can I add something to that? My grandmother,
Okay, we allow Chris Smith here, the library, a friend. We allow him, that's between y'all, I'm not gonna get in the middle of that. He's gonna ask a
I
question.
just want to add to her comment real quick. We pre-planned my grandmother's back in the 70s, but when she transitioned, it wasn't until 2012. And they weren't charging for opening and closing graves. So that, we incurred another cost. And I only had so many days to come up with another $800. So you're right, because they weren't even doing that then when she, everything, their plots and everything were paid for, but they hadn't begun, charging for
When
opening
you
and closing
first started
graves.
off, you got.
If I'm correct, I don't think any pre-planning organization will charge you for opening and closing the grave, because that is a fluctuating cost. And the grave diggers belong to a union. So
Okay.
today they may do it for $5, but next week they may do it for $55. So I think that in all due respect to the funeral home or whomever you do the pre-planning, if they can't tell you when the person's going to die, and they can't tell you what the cost for opening and closing the grave.
Okay.
I did pay for that.
He has something to
Can you leave your contact information? Anybody any questions, we can forward these to you. Okay. Go.
I want to have.
That's what Chris. You started this. No, you're responsible for all this. Okay.
respond to that.
Just respond.
Watch it.
Years ago, you're correct, cemeteries would not accept prepayment for the opening and closing. They would allow you to purchase the property only so that they get the subsequent increases due in the future. Walnut Hill Cemetery, Spring Grove Cemetery, Oak Hill Cemetery will allow you to prepay your opening and closing. Even years ago, Vine Street, which I'm hearing sounds like it may be Vine Street Hill Cemetery, they did not, am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Vine Street will allow today you to pay that fee, but at the time of death, they would like the increase in addition. That is the only cemetery I've ever seen do something like that. But Spring Grove, they would allow you to put $15 extra on the standard fee years ago, and then it will continue to grow. And because all these funds are supposedly set into what you call in escrow accounts or endowment funds that keep growing, keep up with the costs in the future. This is a sad commentary of the African American Cemetery, which is Union Baptist, Beach Grove, Hillcrest. Those funds were not properly allocated to grow for the future upkeep. So each purchase of ground or each purchase of space in a wall or a niche at Spring Grove, the Arlingtons and so forth, they set aside a portion of that money for so that what they call perpetual care. That is the lack of Beach Grove, no perpetual care. But lastly, the townships, if those properties are abandoned or not kept, such as Beach Grove, the I think it's Springfield Township municipality controls the upkeep of that property.
Yes.
So they will not let it become a negligible area that becomes an eyesore in any community, and particularly Wyoming, because it sits right there in Wyoming. It has to be, they tore the buildings down, they cleaned up the frontage. It's still a bad looking facility because you got the hills, it's just moving. So today's cemeteries are level and well kept because they're allowing you to what you call just make sure the grounds are easily maintained. No monuments in the newer cemeteries. I don't know if you noticed that. The newer cemeteries or the new sections of cemeteries, they don't, except Spring Grove, because Spring Grove is the second largest cemetery in all of America. All of America. So it's a vast operation.
Chris, that's it.
That's right.
A patient man.
Thank you. One, I know we were talking about Potter's Fields. One was a curiosity. I know there was a Potter's Field out on Gurley Road,
Yes.
and I believe they buried folks there until 1981. Is that correct?
I had newspaper articles, I had trouble pulling them up, but I pulled articles up on Potter's Field, that sounds about right. But I knew-
Because we have those cards here at the library from that particular Potter's Field. And the curiosity I had, because I don't know, and someone here may, were Potter's Fields ever segregated?
Well, to answer that in closing, the whole city at one time was tremendously segregated. You could not,
I suppose pre-70s, you couldn't be buried at Spring Grove. I'm not sure the actual date, but African Americans could not be buried at certain cemeteries. You had to go to each grove, United American, Old Colored American, United Baptist, Wesleyan, those cemeteries. But today, just like everything, we have perfect rights and liberty to be buried and do what we choose as long as our dollars can pay. And with that said, that's why, go ahead.
Well, the question was Potter's Field, are those segregated?
Were they?
Yes.
I really don't have the answer to that.
And there's no way to tell.
Yeah.
Because each one of the graves that I've seen in Potter's Field, you don't know if it's male or female, you just have a number. Somebody's buried in 1, 2, 3, and there's a little disc, like I said, probably the size of the bottom of this bottle there that says number 1, 2, 3. If you don't know, if you haven't searched the records, as I indicated to the lady, first of all, go and get a death certificate. If the death certificate says that they're buried in Potter's Field 1, 2, 3, and you know that person was African American, you know they're black. If the one next to it, you got the death certificate and you know they're white, then you know that it was an integrated cemetery. But I'd like to, in closing, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for sharing your information with us. And we're going to call on you. Okay, and we did have his address. He's on Wayne Avenue, and he's got a pretty sign out there. Yeah, and he has an office in Middletown. But one thing that kind of addresses that segregation of cemeteries, how many of you know where the majority of African Americans are buried in a cemetery? Well, way back when, they were buried on the west side, because Judgment Day, you're gonna see the coming of the Lord. So if you are looking for, they're looking to the east, they're buried on the west. And you can go. Another little place that you can go, if you have a relative from Kentucky, go to the state of Kentucky. We did a cemetery project there, and a lot of people have family cemeteries. We even indexed some of those family cemeteries, and the majority of them are online. So if you have Kentucky relatives you can't find, go online or go down to Frankfurt to 100, what is that street? The Clark Memorial Building, and they have that information. They can tell you, it's a cemetery project online, and you can get some information. Thank you all for coming.
All right, thank you.
In actuality, there were African Americans buried at Springfield Cemetery. One of the Renfro's mother-in-law was buried there. My question is, they may have not been segregated before then, but where were, again, as she said, where were they buried? In Spring Grove Cemetery. There may have been a section where this was all African American. So Spring Grove, to my knowledge, had burials of African Americans prior to 1970s, 60s, and 50s, because I've seen them online. I've looked at all these death certificates. So, but the question is, where in the cemetery were they buried? And it may speak to the clout of Miss Renfro. We talked about Miss Inez Renfro, how powerful she
My
was.
grandmother's buried in Spring Grove in 1963.
Okay, so she, you know, what kind of influence that funeral and that family that she had would it be buried? So those are those little questions you had to ask. But I know they were buried before the 60s and 50s. I've seen death certificates and all these people there. But again, where were they buried? What's our special section? And go to Spring Grove and ask.
Yeah, well, yeah, and if you have a name, because recently I did a history on, I did two of them, I can't remember which one. They're both buried in Spring Grove in 1800s.
Everybody say,
Amen.
everybody say, amen. Everybody.